Good to be back tonight from college and back at Grand County. It's always a pleasure and a blessing to preach here, and I always appreciate the opportunity, Jason. Thank you very much. I'm going to start off with a really absurd question that I'm sure applies to nobody here, so I'm not sure why I'm asking this. But who here, has sped on the interstate on the road and gotten pulled over for it? I ask for a show of hands, but I assume it's something that's relatable to a few of us. Appreciate your honesty. I'm not sure I'd have the courage, but it's something that happens often with a lot of people. And it's an example, I think, a very common example of something that happens in our life where we know what's right, we know what maybe we should be doing, but perhaps because we are thinking of other things, we think, or aren't paying attention, or for whatever other reason, or because we think we know the better way, the better thing, we substitute what we want to do and end up suffering the consequences for us. This is a very small scale example. I think it's something that happens often in our life, something that's relevant, something that's relatable. And I'd like to think tonight about Genesis chapter 4, which is kind of a similar but way more extreme example of something like that happening with Cain and Abel, where the right thing was known, didn't happen, consequences were suffered. And think about the attitude Cain had in this story, what happens and what he experiences, and what that tells us about God, what it tells us about ourselves. So if you'd like to read with me, I think I'll just read I'll read the first few verses. I think we're on the story well enough, but just to set some context so we kind of have our minds in the right place. It's Genesis chapter 4, which, as you'd expect, follows Genesis chapter 3, a very, very famous chapter in the Bible. We all know, I think, very well. We call it the fall of man, and what happens in it is Adam and Eve are tempted by the devil. They succumb to that temptation. They face the consequences. They're kicked out of the garden. God curses the ground. He curses childbirth. He also sneaks in this messianic prophecy of Jesus crushing the serpent's head. And so we see Adam and Eve kicked out of the garden, made mortal, experiences the curses, and then we get to chapter 4. It's kind of a bleak chapter previously. We get to chapter 4, and then it gets kind of worse as we will read here. But it begins with a new beginning. Adam and Eve kind of moving on. Verse 1 says, "Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I've acquired a man from the Lord. And she bore again his son, his brother Abel. And Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground." Adam and Eve move on, apparently through having kids, I guess, and begin their life outside the garden. They're mortal, they're human, they can die now, and they just live, because what else are they supposed to do? They're no longer living in the garden. What can they do except just keep living? And so they have these two kids that are very different men. Right? Cain is a keeper of he's a tiller of the ground, and Abel is the the keeper of sheep. Not easy to mix up, but I did it. Keeper of sheep, tiller of ground, Cain, Abel. Okay, we got that cleared up. We're moving on. And so we have these two men, and it kind of sets it up for what happens in the rest of chapter 4. And then we see in verse 3 that what they do is they bring forth sacrifices. Which gets us into our first point of this lesson, which is the importance of obeying God. Verse 3 says, "In the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of fruit of the ground to the Lord. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and their fat, and the Lord respected Abel and his offering. He did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell." These two brothers, Cain, Abel, they offered their sacrifices. And one accepted and the other rejected. And my brain was always kind of ran to this idea, and I never really pursued too much because I guess it just is how it goes. But what was the problem with Cain's offering? I think Cain probably had the same thought as I've had before of what's wrong with him offering the fruit of the ground. He was a tiller of the ground. He was the guy who grew plants. So it kind of makes sense to my brain, probably made sense to him, to say, I'm going to offer plants. It was convenient, even. He was the plant guy, so he offered plants because that was easiest. That's what made this most sense for him, perhaps. At least that's what he was thinking. But verse 3 opens with this phrase, and James Montgomery Boyce, an author I read preparing for this lesson, highlighted this phrase, "In the process of time it came to pass that they brought forth the offering." I think that language indicates that there was a certain time period, a certain moment they're supposed to offer these offerings, which then suggests there's a certain form these offerings are supposed to take. And so I think it's natural, it's easy, or it makes sense to say that God told them what to do. They knew what to do. They're supposed to offer their offerings at this time, probably at some specified place, in some specified manner. But Cain does not offer the right sacrifice. That's the issue here. Not that God doesn't like plants, not that God likes sheep better, although I guess that's kind of what's said here. The issue is not what he offers, but the fact that it wasn't what God wanted. And so I think we see here the importance of obeying God, because in verse 5, it says, "He, God, did not respect Cain and his offering, and Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell." And so Cain's attitude here, taking the easy way, taking the medium way, the way that made sense to him and not what God said, was wrong. And then when it was rejected, his countenance falls, and he becomes mad. There doesn't seem to be any responsibility taken. He doesn't, obviously we're not privy to every single thought and feeling he has, but there's this indication that it's rejected and he becomes mad. It's not frustration that he did the wrong thing, but rather that God didn't take his offering when he did the wrong thing. There's no remorse here. So then from there we see this choice that Cain's offering. We see this choice that we're offered. Verse 6, God says to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it." Cain's mad here, and God comes to him not with condemnation, not with anger, but with mercy. He says, "Look, why are you upset? You can fix this." It brings to mind the thoughts that I think we all have sometimes when we make poor choices and show the consequences, and we think, it's the end of the world. I've sinned, I told a lie, I alienated a family member, I did something that wasn't that great, I made poor choices, and I think this is the end of the world. And we forget that it's not, because what God says to Cain here, he says to us. He says, if you do well, will you not be accepted? If you do not do well, sin lies at the door. And so Cain here is presented a choice. He could either take responsibility, he could either do well and be accepted, or he could let sin master him and suffer the consequences of that. Because we see God's mercy here. We see that Cain had a choice to make, and he chose the wrong one, as we all know. Because at no point was Cain's fate sealed. He made, first he could have just made the right choice in the first place, but he made the wrong choice, and he could have fixed it, like God says to. And then ultimately, he could have not killed his brother, but even then, there was still hope, and we'll get to that later. And we see what Cain does after God talks to him. Verse 8, Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel's brother and killed him. And so he chooses murder here. He's given this choice between doing the right thing, doing not the right thing, and chooses the wrong thing. His failure was not unredeemable, but instead of redeeming it, he made it worse by committing murder. Some verses, my Bible has a footnote that says that Cain spoke to Abel and said, "Let us go out into the field," which suggests this is very premeditated. He very much chose to murder Abel. It was not just for a moment, some thing of passion. It seems to be that he talked to him, he had thought forward, I'm going to go out into the field away from people and kill him. So it's this very deliberate choice that he makes when he could have just chosen the right thing. And maybe it wasn't so black and white to him, but it's very black and white to us that he had the right choice in the wrong choice and chose the wrong one. And so then following after this, we see the punishment that follows. Verse 9, then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" He said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And he said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. So now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it shall no longer yield a strength to you, a fugitive and a vagabond, you shall be on the earth. Once again, Cain does something bad, and God comes to him very kindly. You would expect, if you do something as bad as murdering your brother, that God would come at you and I don't know, strike you down immediately, or thunder and lightning and this big confrontation, because this is a big deal, the first killing we ever see in the history of the world. But God comes to Cain very gently, and I think offers him a chance again to choose right. He just says very simply, "Where is Abel your brother?" And I see in this an opportunity for Cain to accept responsibility, to plead for mercy, to in some way make what he did that was so bad right. And he deflects it, and he just nonchalantly, casually makes the killing of his brother seem like no big deal when he says, "I do not know, am I my brother's keeper?" Lying, first of all, and then beyond that, making it seem like he had no connection, there was no responsibility for him at all. Like he was not responsible for Abel at all, even though he was the older brother and probably had some responsibility for him. Is this my job to know where he is? Is this my job to know what he's doing? And I think it's hard to put into words just how awful it is to kill him and then act like it's not a big deal, like it's not your job, like it's nothing that matters. God had already shown him a willingness to accept him after failure. And when God again offers him this chance to maybe make something right, Cain deflects it, he ignores it, he completely avoids the issue. I think it's this incredible hardness of heart that Cain shows. That's chilling almost. And so we see his punishment then. He lays a curse on Cain, something that didn't even happen with Adam and Eve. If you notice in verse 3, God says to Adam and Eve, "I will multiply your sorrow and your conception." He says, "I will curse the ground for your sake." He does not say, "Cursed are you." He says, "Cursed is childbearing and cursed is the ground." And yet here, he lays a curse on Cain, which I think is just a more extreme punishment than we see earlier. And it's a curse on the ground for Adam's. The curse that was laid on the ground for Adam's sake is intensified for Cain, which seems to suggest that Cain, who was the guy who grew plants, can no longer grow plants. I'm sure that's pretty rough. God says you'll be a vagabond and a fugitive, which is pretty rough. But as we see in I believe Genesis chapter 9, that's not what he deserved. Genesis 9:6, God tells Noah after the flood, "Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed," which indicates, and we see it too in the Mosaical law, that whoever killed somebody was then killed. That the just thing here would have been for Cain to die. He killed his brother. The justice would be that he dies in his stead. But God does not do that. He simply says, "You won't be able to grow plants anymore," which in comparison to death is far less severe. Preserving Cain's life is more than he deserved. And so again, God's mercy is seen. And yet Cain, in verse 13 and following, says, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Surely you have driven me out this day from the face of the ground. I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond here. And it will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me." And so maybe that's a valid complaint to say, okay, this is pretty rough. But it was much less than he deserved. And we don't see any remorse here still. We don't see him saying, even embarrassed, like, "My bad, I shouldn't have done this." He's not sorry he did it, but rather he doesn't want to suffer. And so we see him, asking for mercy, but not out of remorse, but for selfishness. And even so, God complies. Verse 15, the Lord says to him, "Therefore, whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." And the Lord set a mark on Cain, lest anyone finding him should kill him. So after everything Cain's done, with his hardness of heart, with his unrepentantness, he begs for mercy, not because he feels bad, but because he doesn't want to suffer. And God says, "Okay, sure, I'll keep you from being killed by those who find you." And so I think the pattern here, like God demonstrates, of mercy from the beginning of history is incredibly powerful, because we see in Genesis 3, when God kicks Adam and Eve out of the garden, they sin, he gave them one thing not to do, and they do it. And he says, you will surely die because of that. And eventually they did, but he kicks them out of the garden, and he promises them a future Savior. In verse 15 of chapter 3, he makes them clothing in animal skins. In chapter 21 of verse 1 of chapter 3, and then throughout this whole story of Cain, when he doesn't do the right thing, God offers him mercy. When he chooses to kill his brother, God offers him mercy. When he asks for mercy, even though he didn't deserve it, God grants him mercy again. And so, within the span of a generation, from Adam to Cain and Abel, we go from disobeying the one singular command humanity was given, to murder, to lying, to whatever else you can even lay on Cain here. And God's mercy is already so abundant and already so apparent, even with how bad people have gotten already, if you can even phrase it that way. Since Cain, I think it's very easy to see that evil's grown more widespread. Here we had one man killing somebody. If you look across the world, murders committed probably thousands of times a day. And yet the mercy that God showed to Cain, he shows to us now. God continues. He continues to pursue, he continues to offer mercy to people who don't deserve mercy. He continues to come to us gently and say, where's your brother? What have you done? Instead of striking us down, instead of the thunder and lightning and scary stuff, God continues to just come to us and offer us chances to make things right. When we choose the wrong thing over the right thing that God's laid out for us, God's merciful. When we make it worse, God's merciful. He always was and he always will be, until he's not. Because what we see here is that Cain was not unredeemable. He had a chance to fix it up until the moment when all of a sudden he kind of didn't, as far as we can tell. And we don't know where he went later in his life. Maybe he became a good person, whatever it was to be a good person back in those days when there was no formally settled law. Maybe he will find it in heaven. I don't really know. I have no idea of how we can know that. But he had all these opportunities again and again and again and again and again until we kind of see the last of Cain. He kind of disappears from history as far as we're aware. And so it seems like, at least explicitly, that we're told about his chances kind of ran out. God gave him this moment and he begged for mercy, but didn't show remorse, and then he kind of disappears. And I think we think the same way. God's mercy is available. We have all these chances, and we see these chances, maybe better than Cain did. But we always think, I've got time. And we do, until we don't. And which is obvious, I guess. But we have all these moments, and we have all these moments until all of a sudden, maybe Jesus returns, maybe we die, and then we don't realize, we don't see our chances running out. And so maybe you all here this morning heard Jason offer an invitation, heard God offer an invitation through Jason. Maybe you were Holly Hill and heard Kurt offer an invitation, God offer an invitation through Kurt. And that was the chance to fix the path that you were on, if you weren't on the right one, to take responsibility for your actions, and to solve them and do better and be accepted. And maybe you didn't take it. And now, again tonight, God is offering this opportunity to make things right, to accept his mercy, and to be accepted. And God continues to until the moment when you don't have any more chances. And so I ask you, and God asks you, if you haven't accepted God's mercy, if you haven't taken him up on his kindness and his generosity each day, God is begging, I'm begging you, do so right now while you have the chance, before the chances run out, during this invitation song as we stand to sing.